Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Concordia University's fourth space. Thank you for joining us for today's event, co-hosted by Concordia University Press and Concordia Social Justice Center. The title of the event is Canada's Place Names and How to Change Them, a conversation between author and publisher. And we're thrilled to welcome Lauren Beck in for this. But to help situate you today, we are streaming to YouTube live from fourth space, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. And here at Fourth Space, we work with university community to mobilize knowledge. By co-creating daily events that examine research questions and look into projects that are in development across the university. We're running today's event as a live stream meeting. So any comments or questions online via raised hand or the chat works very well. But if you're in the space, if you have a question during a Q&A period, just raise your hand. We'll bring a mic over to you so everyone can hear. And with that, it's now my pleasure to hand it over to Ryan Van Huijstee, current director and acquisitions editor at Concordia University Press. Ryan and Lauren, welcome in.
Thank you, Douglas. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, whether in person or via Fourth Space's live stream. And thank you, as always, to our skilled friends and colleagues here at Fourth Space for excellent advice in developing events, for supporting research dissemination, and for making us all look good and more technically proficient than we actually are. My thanks also to the Social Justice Center at Concordia University for their support of this event. I want to begin by acknowledging that land acknowledgements are insufficient in redressing ongoing wrongs and can come across as empty performative gestures. But they are still important in recognizing nations and the names that have been and are still in use despite European colonialism. We are in Tiohtià:ke today, also known as Montreal, in the lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. Today we will be talking with Lauren Beck, professor of Visual and Material Culture Studies and Canada Research Chair in Intercultural Encounter at Mount Allison University. Lauren is also the author of Canada's Place Names and How to Change Them, which Concordia University Press published in 2022. For our discussion today, I am sure you will see how places often have more than one name and have been renamed before. I want to start off by introducing a bit of a name game here to get everyone involved and introduce some of the themes of her book. So, first, what was an earlier European name for Montreal and one that is still in use in some municipal forms today? Anybody? Ville-Marie, right? We'll still see that sometimes in various municipal emblems or in boroughs.
And what does the Marie stand for? I assume, is it related to the Virgin?
Exactly, yeah. I think it was the original name of the town when it was founded in 1642. And then it changed about a century later, I think. The downtown campus of Concordia, where we presently are, was created by the demolition of a lot of Victorian houses in this area. In the process, de Maisonneuve Boulevard, right outside, was created and connected two streets nearby. Does anyone know here what were the former names of these streets that are now de Maisonneuve Boulevard before they were renamed in 1966? So, west of us was St. Luke Street, and east of us was Burnside Place. And this apparently also has to do with the creation of the metro line. Right along here, Maisonneuve was more or less on top of that subway line. This was news to me recently. Another question. Quebec is known for having so many places named for Catholic saints. But this is something I learned from Lauren's book. What percentage of Quebec's names are of female saints? Just a ballpark guess. 0.0, what was that? 5? 20%, right? So very outnumbered. Right?
Yeah.
We're going to talk about that later. I like this question because I think it ties with some of the resource extraction symbolism that is talked about in Lauren's book as well, places that are named after resources. So until 2020, what toxic mineral was formerly the name of the Quebec town of Val des Sources? Bullseye. Asbestos. I think they made the right choice in renaming it. Yeah. So another thing I learned from Lauren's book, excluding street names and buildings, how many places did Lauren Beck identify across Canada that are named McDonald's? This is excluding streets and excluding buildings. How many places named McDonald? Do you remember?
I do.
What is it, Lauren?
I think it's 134.
Correct
last
answer.
Time I counted. But can I just confess that I didn't actually go counting myself? There's a database, and we'll talk about that later, that helped me come up with that figure.
Yes. I want to also connect this to something that we'll discuss a little bit more later on in our Q&A, but what is the only coat of arms in Canada's provinces and territories to include an Indigenous language?
Oh, we had a little hand at the back. No.
Any guesses? Most recent territory, 1999. You got it, Nunavut, that's right. And then this one I know is a bit of a Rumpelstiltskin question, guess this name, but Canada has a federal body that is responsible for standards and policies on place names. Do you know what this body's name is?
The Geographical Names Board of Canada, who have a database that you can look up dirty words. There might be a place named after them, or common names like Toronto, to see where else there might be a Toronto in the country.
Yeah. And then there's provincial databases too, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
The provincial databases, they're kind of hit and miss quality-wise. Quebec has an excellent one. The Toponymic Commission of Quebec has a beautiful database. If you go look for many of the names in this province, like asbestos, it'll show you the historical name, asbestos, and then the contemporary one, Val des Sources, and often tell you, who came up with asbestos? What does it mean? So they've invested a lot. The Canadian version of that is less detailed in terms of context, but yeah, the provinces are a rich source as well.
Right. So I want to thank Lauren for joining us and for publishing this book with us. It's been enormous success. We keep getting more and more favorable feedback and enthusiasm for it. So I really enjoy the fact that we get this chance to sit down and talk about some of the material that's covered in it. So my first question for you, Lauren, is could you let us know what you mean by and include in the term place names?
When I started studying place names, I thought of them as, like maybe 10 years ago, I thought of them as a name, like Montreal. What does it mean? And you unpack that in the case of Montreal in French and the two parts of that word, and think about the history of who named it and whatnot. But increasingly, I've expanded how I think about place names to include other modalities of expressing names. So not just textually, but also visually and materially. And so when we think of a coat of arms, for example, that represents Montreal, that's an excellent example of a form of place name that is visual in nature. A flag, like the Canadian flag, would be another example of a visual place name. But then also there's material forms of place names as well. When I think of the Hiawatha Belt and how it expresses a geography of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy from the Seneca to the Mohawk, and when you look at it as a geographical configuration that represents the alliance and the various things it stands for, that also functions as a form of place name that it projects onto traditional Haudenosaunee territory. And of course, it's material because it's a wampum belt made of wampum strung together. But also, I think of the way that place names are defined through storytelling. And if you talk to maybe an elder about a place that they're familiar with, the way they talk about it might be in terms of their experience there. They might be less interested in defining a fixed term for a name. And so in that sense, to me, increasingly place names are not necessarily fixed. They don't have to be fixed. They could be multivalent, come in different modalities or forms. And depending on one's cultural background or experience might be very different for one person than for another, which points to a big problem. Who gets to decide on the map of Canada in Apple Maps or Google Maps? Who decides what the name is that appears on the map, or the one that I use in order for you all to understand where I want to go? Because so this is, I think, a really interesting question and problem to have that points to colonialism and issues with textual culture as an armament of colonialism, because that's one of the first things that I think we begin to see have quite a bit of power throughout the Americas following the European invasion, is the imposition of textual culture, almost to the point of eliminating other forms of communication, expression, and authority. And so that's why I'm increasingly, I think, of place names as not just being textual labels, because that would be perpetuating perhaps problems with our place names from the past without thinking more broadly about other forms of naming.
I think that's a very detailed way of thinking about it, and it draws out a lot more nuances than I think maybe people would think of when just thinking of a street sign, right? Which tends to take up more attention.
Well, and
right?
as you point out, street signs are very changeable.
Yeah, yeah. We've done a great number of name changes here, right? And I can think of Ottadocken being renamed after who was that terrible person? It was renamed only a few years ago, but in the East End near the Village. Yeah. Were you going to say something?
No.
I was going to turn to the next question. We tend to think of renaming places as a relatively recent practice, probably in part due to the emphasis on the present and the new in journalism and in social media discussions. One of the things that I like so much about your book is that you note how names have been changed in the past. What differences or similarities you see between now and the past when you look at the motivations behind renaming?
I think it's interesting that when we look at saint names, like religiously inspired, almost always Christian names, that was sort of an archive of nomenclature that people used to pull from. And today, I'm not sure that we would see that sort of same group of names being a pool from which we pull if we want to give out a new street name or whatnot. At least in Canada, it might be very different in other parts of the world. So I think that kind of contrast is interesting because it shows that our values as a society, we've also changed quite a bit, but and so have our values. And so when we think about how today we might never name a street after the Virgin Mary, but 400 years ago we had no trouble naming everything after the Virgin Mary. That tells us that maybe with our changes of values, it's okay to think about our namescape and our place names in a similar light for their changeability, for maybe updating them so they better reflect our values. What are our values today? And thinking about naming in that way is more of a flexible means of expressing who we want to be as a collective, but also. Centuries ago, a lot of place names were given out by individuals who happened to have some form of authority, but in a very frontier sort of situation, whereas today, we don't really name, for the most part, places in that same way. We have naming commissions or maybe a policy or a committee. Thank you. Maybe a policy or committee that oversees these things. So there's more of a collective approach to naming today, whereas I don't think there used to be in the past. Did I answer your question well enough?
Oh, I think so. Next question that I have is, your book contains so much information on the varied naming practices that occur in what we call Canada, from the range of naming practices in Indigenous cultures to the post-contact colonial names of Europeans, to settler and missionary co-optation and misrendering of Indigenous names, and now to various renaming efforts, past and present. Is there a particular naming practice that surprised you most when you conducted your research into this project?
I think as I got deeper into thinking about Indigenous names, uh, and how many of them are about wayfinding. They're technologies for finding your way. They're not necessarily fixed, and they may have different meanings to them. Um, and so when I reflected on that, and then I thought about, I'm a newcomer to New Brunswick. I've only been there for 15 years, which means I'm not quite from there yet. I was born in Southern Ontario, and I stick out like everyone knows I'm not from there just by looking at me. I don't know how they can tell. Um, and uh, and if you want to wayfind in a lot of rural communities in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, we often don't seem to use a lot of fixed place names. Rather, if you want to find a store, you have to go to the place where the old Frenchies was beside that building that burned down 25 years ago, where the mayor used to work. And so it takes a while to gather all that place knowledge, but once you do, you have all the markers in place to understand the various experiences of the place. So while Indigenous place naming practices are definitely different for other reasons, I thought it was interesting to just see these parallel sort of wayfinding forms of technology in very different cultural contexts in our country.
I've had a similar experience recently where I was trying to figure out where a venue was with my partner Emily, and we were saying like, "What's the name of TD Studio? What is that?" And it was like, "Oh, I think it used to be La Stral. Where is that though? Oh, it's near Place des Arts, but like past the La Fleur. Like, oh, it was west of that. Yeah, it's nearby." But I guess that's another kind of topic about place names that we haven't really discussed yet so far, but sort of naming rights. How are you thinking about that in this kind of commercial capitalist sort of sphere?
In Moncton, one of those big box stores, I think it's Cabela's, opened up, and in Moncton, New Brunswick. And like in many other communities, sometimes they have to build roads to get to their big box facility off the main road. And then what do you call that road? And in the case of Moncton, there was quite a bit of a discussion because Cabela's, who was the reason for the road to be built, wanted the road to be called Cabela's Road, something along those lines, which I think is what it's called today. But there was quite a bit of discussion about what it means to have city roads that are cleared by city plows being named after commercial facilities. But then going back to your point, I mean, as you and Emily were trying to figure out how to go find this one place, and you're sort of wayfinding through weaving together your experiences of being in the place over time. And so you have these different markers and you're sort of navigating to it. And even though the actual place name or might have escaped you, or some of the place knowledge around there wasn't articulated using names, you were able to sort of have this shared experience because you've been on the ground, you've seen these different stores and shops and whatnot that you mentioned as you passed them. And that's sort of a similar way of wayfinding that you get in Google Maps and Apple Maps, but also in some of the traditional naming practices that we go over in the first chapter when it comes to traditional Indigenous wayfinding and names.
Right. So as an editor, I have to say I have an interest in mistakes and errors, and I have a mental collection of favorite typos from previous books or manuscripts, hopefully manuscripts, not books. One kind of naming practice that you focus on and which really surprised me was how many official names are the result of European settlers misrendering Indigenous languages. In some ways, it feels like Canada's maps are riddled with typos. Could you give some examples that people might be familiar with and tell us what went wrong?
Well, I think, one that comes immediately to mind is Canada, which, is supposed to be the village over there, but somehow became Le Canada. Now it's our country. And the way it's written down is not likely how it would have been written down or captured were that people here to, tell us how it should be spelled and whatnot. So I think that's one factor. But also if we think about Oromocto, New Brunswick, which is a small little settler community. There's a indigenous community like right next to it. They're practically in the same sort of metropolitan area. And the Wolastoqey people there decided to change their name. They used to be called Oromocto First Nation. Oromocto is a Frenchified version of whatever the French thought that that people's name was. And they've recently said, no, we don't want to use Oromocto anymore. We want to use our own name, which has an important meaning. Deep water is what it means. Walamuktutuk. And so they went and they changed their names. They put out signage, and so the Walamuktutuk First Nation on the sign. But then right next door, just across the street, you have Oromocto, the settler town of 10,000 or so people, using a name that the First Nation has now rejected. So I think that's kind of interesting. I mean, not only is Oromocto an appropriated indigenous name, but it's rendered in a way that is it's weird. It's very colonial. It's 250 or so years old. And no longer reflects indigenous, what the indigenous people would call themselves. But also within the town itself, there's the way the streets are named is kind of interesting, because they have a Hiawatha Street, they have Seneca Street, they have Oneida Street, and these are all references to people, Haudenosaunee primarily, there that has no real connection. So the people who laid out the town, they had to come up with names for something. And going back to the pool of saint vocabulary that evidently impacted particularly Eastern Canada in terms of our names, it appears that indigenous names from other parts of the country were imported to this area, the Wolastoqey territory, where there is no relationship. Incidentally, the person who helped design Oromocto was from Montreal. So that is the only connection I can come up with in terms of the two locations. So I think that's interesting, not just contorting an indigenous name like Oromocto, but also kind of taking names out of context from different places in the country and plopping them down in other places. Like there's a Port Huron on the coast of BC, for instance. just weird sort of transpositions that are done by settlers. They're not somehow a group of Wendat created a community out in BC. That's not where the name comes from. So, but then I think it's also kind of interesting, Walamuktutuk First Nation, when they changed their name, their original name is still Oromocto 15, or 17, 27, 26. Oromocto 26 is their official name. But they decided to change all their signs and embrace a new name because without having to go through any official name change process. Because if they wanted to change their name officially as a First Nation, they have to go through a lot of procedures, can I put it like that, including having to consult INAC, Indigenous Northern Affairs Canada, which can take quite a while. Whereas if Oromocto, the settler town, wants to change its name, it might take them a year. It's much more streamlined of a process. I happen to know that in New Brunswick because my town of Sackville recently changed their name, and I was looped into that, and it took us less than a year to do it. So I think that's an interesting contrast and situation in terms of naming to think about when it comes to place name activism, and who has to do more labor than others in order to effectuate greater fairness, accuracy, cultural authenticity in the names that we have.
You mentioned Sackville, and I wanted to follow up on a project that you had been running with many of your students at Mount Allison. Could you tell us a bit about your survey of names in Sackville, New Brunswick?
So I have a second-year course called Maps and Empire. It's the most fun course. I love it. We talk about colonialism, maps, history, cartography, and place names. And I thought it'd be kind of cool to bring in my 55 students or so, divide them up into different project teams, and to go and survey the 134 streets.
Magic number.
We have 134 streets in our community, to interpret them and analyze them in terms of identity. How many streets are named for women? How many for men, white men, indigenous people, people of color, newcomers, and so on. And so we went about that. It was a really great project. Every student had their 5 or 10 names assigned to them, so they had to go do research, and they found that very gratifying because we didn't just stop at the research stage. We then put together a a report and policy recommendations for the town of Sackville, because Sackville, just like its new municipal self that is now included in Tantramar, do not have a place name policy. So there was no sort of reason for how the names were given out over the course of the last couple hundred years or so. As a community's been around since the late 1700s. Most of its streets, though, date from the 1800s. And perhaps not surprisingly, we found something like 15% of the town's names refer in some way to women. Saint names are not popular. Maybe it's because there's not a lot of there was a Methodist community, so maybe they didn't rely as much on saint-related components in terms of their faith community. 15% relate to women in some way, but I think it's kind of interesting that when it came to women, we would see their first name. So we have a Charlotte Street, which is named for one of the subdivision builder's daughters. We have a Ruth Street named for the husband of another subdivision who built another subdivision. So it's our first names. And we all know as women what happens if you get married and maybe you change your last name. It can be difficult to find you in history and whatnot, but also historically women were often referred only by their first name, and that seems to be the case in town of Sackville. So one of the recommendations we made from that report was that the town consider when it's convenient to do so, like when the snowplow runs into a street name sign, for example, to consider updating the sign and adding a last name to Ruth Street. There's room on the sign. It's a very short name. And to think about the plethora of male names and how they might be contextualized better. For example, we have a statue of Lord Stanley. He actually founded the Canadian Studies program at Mount Allison University, the first one in the country. But he also was involved in the creation of the Canadian flag. And so there's a cute statue of him sitting on a bench just like this. And you can go put your arm around him, take an Ussie or whatever with him. And that's in the downtown area of Sackville. And then just outside of town, there's a Stanley Drive. And so we thought, well, Stanley actually has a really famous and accomplished wife who was one of the first women lawyers in Canada and served as New Brunswick's Governor General for a while. What about renaming that street after her? So you keep Stanley so that people still have a historical association with the place because, wayfinding is important, but also you can kind of bring in a little bit more of a representation of women. And of course, there was no places named for Indigenous people, no monuments until recently that related to Indigenous people nor for people of color. A lot of Black loyalists settled in this area of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. So that was a surprise to me. I thought we would see more references to Black loyalists reflected somehow in the place names, but unfortunately, or the monuments even, but unfortunately not yet.
Did you get any kind of response from the municipality from your report?
Well, they must have liked it because then when they went to do their name change, they were like, hey, Lauren, can we meet and talk about the process through which we should undertake reflecting on what our new name should be? So we went from Sackville to Tantramar, but there was many discussions about how to get to Tantramar because we wanted to make sure the town wasn't appropriating an Indigenous name and using it or misusing it. We wanted to make sure that it was not a colonial name. And Tantramar is associated with the Acadian settlers there who diked the region, which is the landscape is particularly noticeable for that. So they chose that because it had a connection to the geography of the region and acknowledged Acadian settlers, even though it's now an Anglophone community. So there's still some colonialism to the name there.
Right.
But nonetheless, that's New Brunswick, I suppose.
Huh. I think this kind of leads to another question here, which is the political responsibility in Canada is often quite tangled up in multi-level government between provinces and territories, the federal government, municipal governments, and First Nations. One thing I was struck by in your book is how many place name changes occur at the local municipal level. Do you have any advice for people who are looking to change the names of their city, their streets, their buildings, and where might they start?
That's a really good question. I think increasingly, as name changes at TMU, Ryerson, formerly Ryerson University, or apparently here as well in Concordia, have demonstrated, many of our institutions and towns and cities, they actually don't have place name policies. And so as a process of undergoing a name change on the scale that Ryerson TMU underwent, required them to develop a policy for changing names. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I just surveyed 8,000 of the incorporated settlements in Canada to find out if they have a place name, and if so, what is it, and what are their place name priorities. And I was unsurprised to find that about only 400 of the 8,000 settlements in Canada have a place name policy. We're still analyzing it, but from what we've found so far, most of them don't mention prioritizing formerly marginalized groups or presently marginalized groups like women or newcomers, people of color, Indigenous people. And so what we plan to do with that is to prepare a form of, a report, but a draft policy that helps provide some language that will hopefully help institutions or governments, municipal governments in particular, think about ways that they can set priorities for the future. Because if you set priorities for the future, then when that new subdivision comes around and the person building that or in charge of building that, they often get a say in what the street names will be. And some municipalities have rules about that. For example, some municipalities say that if you build a new subdivision, all the streets have to have some thematic linkage. So I grew up in Kitchener, one of the places I grew up, I lived on Pinehurst Crescent, and all of the streets in the area had the word forest in them or some version of a tree name in them. To the point where there's like a Pinehurst, a Pinecrest. It was kind of convoluted, but
A little confusing too,
it was a little confusing.
especially if you're driving a cab.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that was before we had like Google Maps. So I think that by having priorities, that when those next subdivisions go up, a more meaningful engagement with accomplished women, for example, could inspire those street names. But also, if you are part of a community or an institution like this one, and you see a problematic name or monument or emblem, and students are really good at the last two in particular, look for the policy, look for who should be in charge of a policy, and get a conversation going more broadly. And you have social media, student networks in particular. You could talk about it in your classes if you're a professor, or with the media if they'll talk to you or you talk to them, as a possibility for raising awareness and just getting a conversation going more broadly. And I think of that as place name activism. And it's kind of a neat topic, so it gets people talking about what matters to them. And also, why does that monument or sign bother you? What do you find problematic about it, about them? And to share your own experience. I think by making a connection with a place name personal, or a monument personal, you'll have a better chance of building more buy-in with others, because they might share facets of your identity, or have a sister or mother or and whatnot who share those facets as well.
For those looking for policies as examples, are there ones that might be available through Geographical Names Board of Canada or the provincial bodies that are also names boards? Or are they also sort of uncertain?
So if you're interested in all of the municipal policies, on my website, the Center for Early Modern Visual Culture, I have a database there that is just gone up. So it doesn't have all of them, only about 300 of them, but they're there. When it comes to the provinces, most of them, and territories, they usually have policies about the steps to propose a new name or to change a name, posted on their website. In the case of New Brunswick and the Toponymic Commission of Quebec, there's a form to fill out to propose something, and they have certain rules, like you need to get a certain number of people who have lived in a community. I think this is the case in Quebec, like 50 people who have lived in the community to say that they know the place by that name or something along those lines. So some of the bar for making a change is a bit difficult, particularly if you're asbestos and you just don't like your name anymore for various reasons. The idea of changing the name to something that is has more prevalence it doesn't really work in that context because they just wanted to distance themselves from a name so that, they'd have better tourism and business development opportunities, I think. But in terms of municipalities, they seem to have the most robust place names, probably place name policies, and that's probably because they have to provide so much guidance about names. The city of Calgary, I think, is kind of interesting. Their place name policy is very similar to other larger cities in Canada, but they provide some language about how to buy rights to names, how you can purchase a name of like a street name, for example, a park name, I think, as well. So not all municipalities are that, thinking about it so accumulatively,
Right.
but it's an interesting possibility, I suppose, depending on what your priorities as a city are in terms of
Sure.
revenue.
I was reading yesterday, I think, about London for London Fashion Week had renamed Bond Street subway or tube station Burberry Street just for the day or the week, and it had caused a great deal of confusion. So watch out for the naming rights.
Yeah. That's a curious one.
I wanted to turn to another question, which is, given the topic, there are offensive names that are discussed in your book, many of which make a reader cringe, especially how common it was for racial epithets to be used in past and current official names. But there are also ones that can cause involuntary laughter, like the famous dildo Newfoundland. I hate to deprive the world of a good laugh. Is there a funny name you wished you'd been able to include in the book? And where is it?
So in the third chapter, I go through some examples that talk about, in particular, women. Usually, I think I was sort of trying to get at the root of why are there so many names for old women? Not wise women, but old women, and not old men. And so I was thinking about that, and so when I did not include in the book any reference to a very strange practice also in Newfoundland. There's a lot of naked man places.
Really?
Naked Man Cove, Naked Man Beach,
Go
Naked
on.
Man, Naked Man Shoal, Naked Man Park. Not naked men, just naked man. And there's a lot of naked men, but very few naked women, which I thought was curious because usually the women get to be the naked ones when it comes to the place names. But in Newfoundland and Labrador, no, it's the men who get to be naked.
I guess a lot of very cold bathing out there.
Must be.
It's been 10 months since we published your book, and we know it has received a lot of favorable feedback from readers, since we've already had to reprint it, especially. But even when a book is done, there's still what we readers do with it and how we respond to it, how we think about it. Is there feedback or suggestions or comments from readers that most surprised you or that made you reconsider the topic or changed your thinking about place names, naming practices, and renaming efforts?
I think after the book came out, several media people or just colleagues who had read the book, I was surprised by many of them having a very similar comment, and that was at the beginning of the third chapter. I begin it talking about my own connection to my own experience going to universities or schools, living in various cities and towns throughout Canada, and how all of them are named for men. And I'm a woman. I don't get to come from a place or have studied at an institution named for women. And that seemed to resonate with people, and that really taught me something about because talking about changing place names can be threatening to some people. But when you personalize it in that way, there just seems to be a greater connection that gets made. And I thought I really learned a lot from that as I go on to build other projects that related to this book, the importance of personalizing some of these more delicate issues. Because when you draw it down to that, as a woman, I may never get to come from a place named for a woman. You can imagine how other forms of marginalized identity experience Canada in a very similar way. So that sort of underlines the need to maybe think about our naming priorities for the future.
Right. Last, I wanted to talk a bit more about the visual aspects of the book. Visual emblems of names are another key aspect of this work, and you mentioned that earlier. I like how you have discussed and criticized the ways in which flags and coats of arms reinforce or codify place names. Your discussion of the Nunavut coat of arms still strikes me as the best alternative to European settler hegemony, but perhaps you have others that you've since discovered and might want to share. And I do have a slide actually of the Nunavut coat of arms here, which I think maybe we should just share so we can see that.
It's kind of cool when you look at coat of arms because except for Nunavut, most have existed for like a really long time. But for me, this coat of arms was designed in, I think it was 96, 97. And when I was like 18. And so I remember when Nunavut was declared a territory, and that just had never happened before in my experience or since, I guess. And they designed this coat of arms. And what's really cool about it, well, first of all, the coat of arms genre gets to be a big thing in the medieval period. And there's like a whole bunch of rules and sometimes laws governing how coats of arms work. So there's a language here that is very European in terms of origin. But what they've tried to do is swap out as much as possible European stuff and to insert instead elements relating to and that unfold important parts of Nunavut identity. So, for example, toward the top, we have the crown, which points to our relationship with our former colonizer. But that might be one of the only explicit references to colonialism, other than the coat of arms genre itself. Underneath the crown, you have the igloo, which represents the legislature of. So in English, we often call the provincial legislatures the House, like the House of Commons. Well, here they chose instead to use an igloo. You have the kulik, the lamp used for wayfinding, the stars, and then on either side you have traditional fauna that you find, and flora toward the bottom, the ice and the water, and then you have the place name. Or the motto, which is escaping me at the right now because I don't read that language. But it's something like Nunavut our strength, I think, something along those lines, written not in English, not in French. So I thought that was really cool. No other province or territory does that outside of the colonial languages. There may well be having a different database of coats of arms of Canada, of all the municipalities. And having gone through that material, that's quite a few of them, so far, I haven't found anything similar in any of the other settlements. Surely First Nations, however, have some form of coats of arms or flag that might be different. But I thought it was interesting that Nunavut chose to take this pathway. And I wonder what kind of inspiration we might draw, because we do update our coats of arms every now and again in very small ways. Were we to think about updating our coats of arms, that might be a fun project to do as a nation.
I remember you recently shared this one with me as well, coat of arms for the Mexican state of Sinaloa.
Yes, Sinaloa. So coats of arms throughout Latin America have a lot more indigenous content to them. Like in this case here, the shape, the round circle part that forms the shield is the cross-cut cross-section of a dragon fruit, which is an important staple there. And in each quadrant, there's elements that relate to primarily to industry. What really catches my attention as someone who got into academia studying 16th century Mexican Spanish stuff is the footprints on top. And traditionally, in terms of like Nahuatl ideographic language, when I see footprints rendered in that fashion, that tells me where indigenous, in this case from Mexico, indigenous people go. It indicates their presence, their activities. And so I thought it was really cool to see the footprints there, because Spaniards, the colonizer, never get represented with footprints. They get represented with horse hoof prints. And so the absence of the horse, the absence of the hoof prints is a deliberate choice here. And then, of course, surmounting the dragon fruit at the top is the eagle standing upon the cactus with the snake in his mouth, which relates to the Aztec or Nahuatl origin story. So a collection of symbols, anyways, that really resonate and reflect Indigenous traditional stories and ways of expression, but still very colonized in terms of how it's structured and whatnot.
For the visuals, I think I want to just turn back to a map that we've both discussed and that is reproduced in the book as well. And I think one of the things that's always sort of struck me about this is that we do see this period where there are simultaneous names. There, you can see here on the left corner of the map, you'll see Rivière, Mississippi, ou Colbert. Right? After Colbert de Torcy, I suppose, from Louis XIV's administration. Or you'll see Lake Erie, ou Lac du Comté. Could you talk a bit about this map, its provenance and its period?
I love this map for the cartouche that you can't see here, but also the way it was produced. So this is a hand-drawn map. And it's huge. It's about 5 feet tall, 8 feet wide. It's very large. And it was designed in 1682 by a guy named Bernoux, who wanted to become the next bishop of France's next colony. So he had ambitions. He created this map, and it was meant to be unfurled before the king and his advisors at Versailles. And everyone at the time in the 1680s, they're pretty obsessed, if you're from France, with the Mississippi region. They were pushing into that region. A lot of French names are there. And they were among the first Europeans to kind of connect the Mississippi up with the Spirit River in the Gulf of Mexico by New Orleans. Anyway, so what he did is he knew who would be looking at this map in Versailles. And so he created double place names. So Colbert, a very influential person at the side of the king, naming the most important river for the Europeans have been pursuing anyways for a while after him is a powerful choice. Lac de Conty being the brother of the prince, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, Lake Erie is still Lake Erie. Mississippi River is still Mississippi River. So these names don't stick. But if you go into these geographies and go take a look at the street signs and whatnot, you will see these names reflected back from you within these geographies. So I think that's kind of interesting. And unfortunately for Bernoux, he never did get his bishopric. Nouvelle Biscay didn't really come together because the French quickly move on and do something else with their colonization efforts. But yeah, it's a special map for that reason.
I think it's funny to think about how many names might have succeeded and various people trying to be obsequious with their superiors at court.
Well, and I wonder how close we became to being called. We couldn't be called New England, that already existed, because here on this map we have Canada or Nouvelle France. It's a French language map, and 100 years later, Canada looks very different along Franco-Anglo lines. And so that would have been interesting. If Nouvelle France had stuck over Canada, would we be New Britain or something like that? So
right. That's all the questions that I have for right now. But perhaps anybody attending online or in person has a question for Lauren?
I'm not sure if we have anyone online has any questions. You can write them in the chat or raise their hand. I'm not sure if they have anyone right now. Willing to do that? We'll check. And anyone in the space, of course, we get a mic to you if you have a question.
I was wondering if there were a lot of named places named after animals, but in general.
I mean, so in my book, I do not pursue that topic specifically. I don't think, but there certainly are. I think in the case of New Brunswick, there's a place called the Gaspereau River. Gaspereau being the French word for herring, and then like a little bit up, there's a herring river. Spelled in English. That's the contours of colonization in that particular province. So you have two different languages. You can have very similar place names, and of course, there's indigenous names as well for herring. The word's escaping me now, that also coexist. So you do see that often for fish. But it would be interesting to look at that topic more broadly to see how different provinces have pointed to something other than salmon. Salmon's a very popular place name. It's probably the most popular that I've encountered, as opposed to dog or cat or something else. But also one of the questions I think I do raise in the book is to what degree are those names inspired by indigenous knowledge? For example, this is a great river to get salmon. So Salmon River becomes a Red River or Sparkling River. Those could be other permutations of the same name. Or a settler assessment of the river where there's actually no salmon at all. There's like whitefish going by, trout or something. And so like we notice that disparity, that sometimes there's names handed out with animal names or flora and fauna names where there's no presence of that species. Maybe there once was, but maybe there never has been. So that would be an interesting collaboration with somebody interested in biology or ecology to better understand that question. It's a good idea.
Hi, thanks. That was great. So I was unaware that there had been a name change in Sackville, and you guys alluded to it a few times, but I wonder if you can talk more about what brought it about, and also like, is Sackville no longer Sackville now? Is it? Okay, I'd like to hear more.
Well, so what gave rise to us having to change the name is the province decided to have some municipal reorganization. So they took a few other small towns in our area and combined us and said, "You're a municipality now, go figure out your name." And so that process was initiated in 2020, 2021, and our new name, we came up with it in consultation with all the different communities in 2022. That being said, when you drive into, so Tantramar exists, you can find it in the Geographic Names Board, Name Board Canada's database. When you drive into town, you still see Welcome to Sackville, founded in 1770 something, that sign. Same with Dorchester, same with the other communities. And when you look in the place name database, I mean, the towns have not been unincorporated. They still exist, but they exist within this municipality. As a result, the people who do our snow clearance, the town, it used to be the town of Sackville plow, for example. Well, we have more than one plow. It snows a lot. Would have the Sackville coat of arms on the side, but now they're in a process of trying to figure out what the Tantramar coat of arms should look like, and it takes a while to update all your signage, all your letterhead, come up with your new symbolic, your new look. And so I think what we're going to see is over time, references to Sackville will become more peripheral, and Tantramar will be more of a focus. We've seen this happen all over the place where there's amalgamations, like in Halifax or here, or where you have communities that retain or neighborhoods that retain their original names. You know what they are. They used to be a town or maybe a small city, but they become part of a larger GTA is a great example of that, Greater Toronto area. And so I think that's what's going to happen. That being said, and as is the case of asbestos, I've never been to the town. I would love to go visit and to see what all the businesses are doing with their signs, because you can imagine the town of asbestos garage. It's kind of expensive to go and update your sign, especially if it's a fancy one with neon lights and whatnot. But also to get used to using a new name, that can be really challenging as well. So I still call it Sackville. I recognize it as Tantramar. I try and use Tantramar, but I keep forgetting. And I don't know if that'll get easier as I get older, or if it would be easier if I had a child in school right now, if they're using Tantramar and that's what they've heard for most of their life. I suspect, though, by the end of my lifetime anyways, Tantramar will be more used than Sackville. Good question.
Any other questions? Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Lauren. I hope people read the book. There's a lot more to find out in it, and I'm so thrilled that we finally got to meet in person after we've been working together, since 2019,
Something like that.
2020?
Yeah,
Finally met today for the first time.
it's about time.
Oh, and I remembered, it was Amherst. That was the name that was renamed Ottadocken in the village. There we go. It just came to me. On that note, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Fourth Space. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you to everyone in the space. Thanks for coming into Fourth Space today for this conversation. Everybody online, those of you in the space, thank you for the questions, of course. We're going to be closing up our Zoom, closing up the live stream, but just a reminder, this conversation is already available online if you would like to revisit or share it. But please join us again next time. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you again, Ryan and Lauren, for coming in. And
Thank you, Douglas.
Thank you for having us.
bye.